Without greater precision, we risk misunderstanding people's needs and misdirecting care. Yes, and without actually listening to clinicians who are really doing the on-the-ground profiling and individuating of people who need this diagnosis, we risk creating a giant moral panic and creating a giant mess over something that's gonna have no actual impact to society, funding, or people's lives. Hello and welcome to the Trauma-Informed SLP. I am Kim Neely. SLP stands for Speech Language Pathologist, of which I am a licensed one here in the United States with over 10 years of clinical experience. And on this channel, I use that clinical experience, my special interest in trauma-informed care, my graduate studies in speech, my graduate studies in neuroscience, my experience as a late diagnosed neurodivergent and a queer person to unpack things, many, many things. I might have a dog coming in this room soon. I feel like I just heard my dog. And for today, I just recently stumbled upon this article by Paul Carey from thenationalnews.com says, has autism spectrum become too wide? Pioneering psychologist says definition needs an overhaul. And the subtitle says, expert calls for rethink of how autism is diagnosed. Now, I did do a response video to, I think it was PBS NewsHour or something. I'll put the little card up on basically this same sort of question of should we split up the spectrum when it comes to like medical needs or not. And listen, there's a few things that I'm going to bring up in this. I'm going to respond to this article though, because this is a really big researcher, formerly a very big researcher in autism research. There's some issues though with her stance that I have. I believe Autistic AF actually did a really great breakdown of her stance as well, because I think she did like an interview or something that he was doing a response video to, and his I'm not gonna lie, his videos are better than mine, so you know, I feel you if you just want to hang out with him. I understand. But you know, if you like my takes too, go ahead and subscribe and hit like and stuff. That would be super helpful and super nice. I'll put a link below to his video, but go ahead and check out my PBS NewsHour if you'd like. But to establish a few things about this, in terms of how I talk about this, I feel like I have to reestablish this. If you haven't been to this channel before, you might not know this, but I tend to not talk in the whole level 1, level 2, level 3 thing that a lot of people use, because those levels are technically part of the individual profile that is built through diagnosis. Okay. So you could be one person who's like level 1 in social communication, but like level 2 in sensory needs. Okay. Like one person can be multiple levels. That's the intention of that. And it's just part of the overall profile of the person. But in social discourse, it's not often used that way, right? Online with like kind of the self-proclaimed autism moms and such, they tend to talk about level 3 autistics. That tends to be the bigger divide here of talking about late diagnosed autistics versus level 3 autistics, okay? Like your autistics who are able to hold a job and be independent and live as an adult versus autistics who need lifelong medical care, okay? Or lifelong caregiving, right? And so I don't tend to like talking about the levels when I'm talking about groups, because the levels are not intended to be used as group distinctions. They are intended to be used for an individual's current profile. That also means that someone could be a level 1 autistic when they're younger and become level 3 if they happen to have some sort of medical condition or an accident or something, or like a brain injury or something that now needs full-time medical care. Now they're suddenly a level 3. So that's my main issue with that, is the levels can change over time. People's profiles can change over time depending on their environments and their supports and extenuating circumstances like medical conditions and such. And that's part of creating an individual profile. That's the due diligence of clinicians. That's the due diligence of physicians and clinicians who make these diagnostic profiles, right? That's our job to keep track of. And as the medical team involved with that particular autistic's case, it's also our job to collaborate and to discuss and to observe if there's changes happening, right? So I like to classify, there's a couple different classifications here that you might hear me use. When I'm talking about social adversity, I tend to borrow terms from the greater disability community, and I use apparent or non-apparent. Those are my two main categories there. So like people with disabilities, or really like any marginalized person, you could be a non-apparent marginalized person or someone with a non-apparent disability. People might call it an invisible disability. I like the term non-apparent because not all things that make the disability obvious are visual. Sometimes it's how somebody sounds, or if they are talking at all, if they're a speaker or not, right? And then there's apparent disabilities or apparent autistics, okay? And there can be different things that make someone apparent. It doesn't automatically mean they're level 3, 100%, but they might be level 3 in terms of needing a speech generating device to communicate broadly because they might be a non-speaker, but maybe cognitively they're a level 1, can go through school, can go through college, just like Jordan Zimmerman, and get out there and be an advocate and be amazing, right? Because speaking ability and cognitive ability do not equate to each other. Non-speaking doesn't mean non-thinking. I'm going to keep saying that. Non-speaking doesn't mean non-thinking. Yeah. There can be a lot of things with that. So I like non-apparent and apparent when I'm talking about social adversity and like barriers to accessing things and stuff like that. And then one of the things that also distinguishes, I think, non-apparent to apparent, especially when it comes to this discussion, is people who need medical needs from the medical model of disability versus people their main disability is in the social model of disability side. Other autistic advocates out there have talked about this in the past, and they've gotten a little confused. So quickly, just to clarify, social model of disability is the one that says the main disability issue is in social norms and in people not being willing to accommodate or try to understand the needs of people with more non-apparent disabilities for the most part. Okay, non-apparent and social model tend to be kind of together, not always, but you can kind of think of those as sort of, okay, yeah, those go together. And people with apparent disabilities, they also definitely fit into social model of disability, but they also have a medical model of disability. Medical model of disability was the one that was confused as a pathological model, which is different. Pathologizing in medical terms is looking at something as a disease and thinking this is like something to cure, or like you see X and Y is the solution. Very linear. Using a pathogenic paradigm is fine if you're like fighting viruses or bacteria infections or something like that, right? Something that like is, or cancer cells, okay? Something that like is a threat to human life, fine, right? If the solution really is kill the cancer cells, get rid of that bacteria, get that virus out of the system, yeah, okay, we can pathologize that, sure. The problem comes when you pathologize humans, right? And so the pathology model of research and medicine, intervention-wise for autistics for a very long time, was very much focused on what caused autism and how can we cure it, okay? And we now know through decades of work and research and other type of researchers and other autistic researchers coming in and doing some studies that like autism is very broad, very complex, and it's not something to cure outright in that way. However, where this gets really muddy socially is when people are talking about the medical model of disabilities and how there are autistics out there who have comorbid medical complexity. That's what you'll probably hear me say. Children or people with medical complexity. This is a term that exists in clinical work and in medical work to describe somebody who has a lot of things going on. They have multi-system things going on. So they have some kind of condition that's affecting maybe their cognition, maybe their communication, but also like their digestive system could be affected. Maybe their endocrine system, their hormone system is affected. Maybe, their neurological system as a whole is affected. They have sensory issues or motor issues. Multiple organ systems are involved. That's medical complexity, okay? The more medical complexity you have, the more medical needs and support you need, right? The more you need to access medical care, medical caregivers, assessments, maybe devices to help you move through your day, like ambulation, right? So most common example of that would be using a wheelchair or using crutches, but there's other ambulation type things, right? That would be a medical device thing. A speech generating device for communication would be a medical device that you need money to access, unfortunately, at least in the United States, because, the medical system in the United States is a hellscape. Total side note. I love it when you're on Reddit and someone's complaining about the medical system and people from other countries are like, you're American, right? Because this is horrible. This is not how it works where we are. And I'm like, yeah, see, please let us know how horrible it is. We really need to get on doing something about this. This is insane. So to review really quickly, let's review this. We've got, in terms of medical and also research, you have the pathogenic model or pathogenic paradigm, where you're looking at something as a disease or as a danger, and you're looking at ways to eliminate that thing, right? You're looking at ways to cure it, okay? Like I said, it does have its place, right? There is another model called the salutogenic model. That's something that trauma-informed care falls under, but salutogenic is looking at the whole person, the whole family unit, and looking at ways to improve quality of life, okay? So that's salutogenic. Now, those two things are separate from social model of disability and medical model of disability. Both of those models of disability can fit under the salutogenic paradigm. They can fit under that if you're thinking of medical as being needing access to certain medical care and certain medical devices to improve quality of life and to improve independence. And I think the bigger issue here with the social online discourse and with that PBS video that I did the response to, I do think some of the bigger issues here is in pushing for something to help with accessing medical needs for the complex medical needs kids. So let's go through this article now that I've sort of established those terms, because I think it'll hopefully help to break down what's going on here with Uta Frith. Professor Dame Uta Frith. This article says, it's from thenationalnews.com. I'll put a link in the show notes, or in the notes below. They're not really show notes on YouTube, are they? What are they called? Anyway, description, video description. There we go. I'll put the in the description below. Show notes is like a podcasting thing, but yeah. I have like a professional podcast also called the Trauma-Informed SLP, but I've decided to make the audio one more focused on just professional issues in my field. So if you like to hear people talking about professional things, go over there if you wish, or if you are an SLP, feel free to check it out. Okay, so this says, has autism spectrum become too wide? Pioneering psychologist says definition needs an overhaul. Experts call for not experts, just one. Expert calls for rethink of how autism is diagnosed by Paul Carey. All right. I have it on the reader program here, so hopefully it won't have ads coming up. All right. One of the world's leading experts on autism has questioned the current definition used by clinicians, suggesting it is so broad that it risks confusion and misdiagnosis. Autism is currently diagnosed as autism spectrum disorder, a single condition that includes a huge range of people, from those needing round-the-clock care to those who live independently. So in my terminology, that would be people with complex medical needs all the way up to like non-apparent autistics. In typical social media discourse, this would be the level 1 versus level 3. That's the shorthand most people would use when they talk about that. And like I said, I don't like it because levels were not intended to be used as group definitions. They're intended to be individual profiles. Okay. Professor Dame Uta Frith, whose research in the 1960s and 1970s laid the foundations for how autism is understood, asked whether the autism spectrum has become too broad to be useful. Writing in the journal Psychological Medicine, the University College London professor said, autism wasn't always defined this way, a sort of catch-all diagnosis for a huge variety of conditions. Okay, I don't know. When it was first identified in the 1940s, it referred to a small group of children with severe difficulties in social interaction, communication, and behavior. Over time, the definition has widened to include people with milder traits and no language or learning problems. Okay, kind of, sort of, yes, kind of, sort of, no. When autism was technically first studied, the first place it was sort of looked at, it was thought of as a form of schizophrenia. It wasn't even an autism diagnosis thing. Like before the 1940s, it was like these kids were considered schizophrenic. So that would definitely be more kids who are institutionalized with more pretty significant, impacts and significant profiles, probably, to be confused more with like a schizophrenia thing. I'll have to look into this. And this might be a good video sometime, more of like the history of autism and how it was diagnosed. So she's right that it wasn't really defined that way, because then you also had Asperger's in World War II who saw very certain similarities, but some of the kids didn't have the really severe difficulties. They were less severe. So they got considered more useful to the Nazis, because that's what Asperger was doing. He was separating out the severe kids who the Nazis did to them what they did to the Jewish people and all the other people they considered not so great. So, and then I can't quite remember if the Asperger diagnosis, it wasn't like immediately added, but that's why the like milder traits, or what's thought of as the milder traits, it was Asperger's. And then it got lumped in together for autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5, because it turns out there's a lot more complexity. Turns out we needed a bigger spectrum, because there are kids who get lumped into Asperger's as a diagnosis. And Asperger still exists as a diagnosis, by the way. That still exists in other countries. Not all countries use the DSM-5 as the diagnostic criteria. So, it still exists out there. But essentially, the idea is there are people who are non-apparent, meaning they are able to mask. They are given the option to mask, and they're able to mask their autistic traits. So the kids or the people who maybe they didn't actually have milder traits, they were just able to hide them better, but then they still that just meant that they didn't get any help. And the burnout came later, and the difficulties in life came later, right? So like we're starting to understand that more, which is a bigger understanding, right? Which makes sense as diagnostic stuff grows, as different literature and research is introduced, our understanding becomes more complex over time. Same thing has happened with the diagnosis of Alzheimer's and dementia and other types of dementia, right? Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. There are other types of dementias out there. And like dementia was not a diagnosis in like the 1900s, okay? That was when older people just got eccentric. Uncle John's just walking around in the wheat field over there doing his thing. Old Uncle John thinks he's still 12. It was eccentricity. Am I saying that right? I'm not saying that right. But they were eccentric, okay? We didn't have dementia as a thing. People saw it happening, but we didn't have that as a thing. Same thing with like post-traumatic stress in war veterans, right? That has been explained in stories post-war for like soldiers after war for centuries, if not millennia. We have seen signs of what they would call shell shock in World War I. And now we have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and now we've researched it more, and now we have a deeper understanding of what that is. And it does encompass more than what it initially was thought to encompass. And same thing's happening with autism spectrum. So it makes sense that it's broadening, right? All right, let's get back to the article, though. I have some more to say about those things. Frith goes on to say, today, anyone of any age or intelligence level can be diagnosed with autism if they meet certain criteria. End quote. The number of people diagnosed with autism has increased dramatically from about 4 in 10,000 children in the UK in the 1960s to around 1 in 57 school children today. 75 million people, or approaching 1% of the world's population, are thought to have some form of autism. Now, 75 million people sound shocking, but it's 1%. That's not that much. Professor Frith, Emeritus Professor of Cognitive Development at the UCL Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience, said the dramatic rise in global cases was down to greater awareness and less stigma, broader interpretation of diagnostic criteria, more people identifying with autism online, self-diagnosis, and social media influence, as well as a cultural shift towards explaining everyday life problems via medical labels. She started good. You know, she had me in the first half, not gonna lie. Professor Frith's 50-year career researching the cognitive underpinnings of autism is longer than nearly everyone else's, and she was among the first people to explore the types of autism using newly available brain scanners in the 1990s. She developed 2 landmark theories about how autistic minds might develop differently to neurotypical minds. First was, They were the theory of mind deficit, the idea that autistic people may find it harder to infer people's thoughts, beliefs, and intentions, and weak central coherence, which is the proposal that autistic cognition tends to focus on details rather than the bigger picture. So not seeing the forest for the trees, essentially, that would be the saying around weak central coherence. Autistic individuals may excel at noticing fine details, but find it harder to integrate them into a broader contextual understanding. In her new paper, she argues that not all autism diagnoses look the same, highlighting research showing a big difference between people diagnosed in childhood and those diagnosed as teenagers or adults. Early diagnosed people often show clear signs from a young age and may have language or learning difficulties, while those diagnosed later are more likely to have average or high intelligence and may also have conditions such as anxiety, depression, or ADHD. Some studies have suggested they are not the same condition. Professor Frith warns that expanding the definition of autism may lead to people being given an autism label when even another condition might explain their difficulties. This matters because diagnosis shape treatment, identity, and support. A wrong diagnosis can lead to the wrong help or no help at all, she said. Okay. Yeah. She's not wrong, but it lacks... How do I want to say this? She's missing the forest for the trees, I think, a little bit on this. Okay, like, I think... No offense, Professor Frith. I think she has, this is my opinion, I think she might have some weak central coherence around this issue, okay? And I'm not trying to shade her too bad, okay? I'm really not trying here, but it is true that the wrong diagnoses can lead to issues with treatment, not getting identity, not getting support. And it's also true that earlier when she said that there's increased awareness and reduced social stigma and blah, 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 and you're missing the whole, what's missing between, the connection between those things that I think are really being missed here is that, like, the increase of diagnoses is most often in social classes that were not studied when she first started in the 60s and 70s. It's in women, non-binary people, and racial and ethnic marginalized groups. They're the people who are most often missed, and those are who the late diagnoses are most often coming in on, okay? And a lot of those people got diagnoses, but they weren't the full picture. Like she says earlier, let me go back up there. Hold on. They may also have conditions such as anxiety, depression, or ADHD. Guess what likely got diagnosed first? For most people for whom the diagnostic criteria is not overtly obvious, for these groups of people, they were just completely straight up ignored by researchers back when she started researching, okay? And so they likely have another diagnosis, mental health type related thing. And then they probably, I mean, I got anxiety, depression first. Those were my first things to deal with, right? And a lot of people got that. There's a lot of, especially in the United States, a lot of capital B Black Americans who get later diagnosed autistic. A lot of them have oppositional defiant disorder as a diagnosis, ODD, because they have these like defiant behaviors of like protesting or something, or getting overwhelmed and having meltdowns, and that being overly interpreted as like a tantrum or aggression or something. And so they end up with these, in my opinion, gross misdiagnoses that result in being treated atrociously, quite frankly, and being profiled very incorrectly, and not being able to access the appropriate support. And then later on in life going like, oh, I'm actually autistic. And if I had been treated autistic in school and not ODD in school, I probably would have done a lot better. Because social stigma can't be taken out of this. That cannot be removed from the narrative, okay? So that's why it's like, she had me in the first half, that whole like, we have greater awareness, 100%, more people seeking out diagnoses. Number 2, less stigma, yes. Far less stigma when it comes to people who were never studied, but who still fit the criteria. And broader interpretation of diagnostic criteria, that is just from literally enfolding Asperger's into autism spectrum. That was what made it broader. That was it. We took one thing that looked pretty much the same and we put it in this other category and went, hey, this belongs over here. DSM-5 has done this before, guys. Same thing happens with like anxiety disorders. So like, it's okay to broaden it and to have these categories in DSM-5, in my opinion. It doesn't make that much of a difference because diagnosis is still individualized. That's the point. It still needs to be individualized, and it's always should be individualized. So I don't think Uta Frith has ever really practiced as a clinician, and if she has, I think she practiced a long time ago. But this is one thing that sort of happens with researchers when they feel like they're the expert and they know things, but they never work as a clinician, is they miss the fact that like when you're diagnosing an individual versus being a researcher, researchers are looking at groups and looking at trends, they're looking at big picture, and they're looking at how can we find similarities here to help with diagnosis or help figure out what's going on here or whatever, right? Clinicians are focused on the person in front of them. They're like when I do an assessment on somebody, I'm focused on that person. I'm using standardized tests, blah, 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 right? To get a profile. And I'm also using informal things like interviews and whatnot to also get a profile and questions and questionnaires and whatnot. And then I am developing a profile of this individual. And then I use that data to determine what I think this person's strengths and weaknesses are, what kind of diagnosis that relates to, right? What is this show? What is the data showing me in terms of what might be going on here? And then, you know, severity can be determined from that. And then goals can development, you know, I could develop treatment goals and stuff from that too, right? But it's highly individualized. And so it's not research. It's not the same thing, right? It's not the same thing as empirical research. And so diagnostic criteria, broadening it when we have realized that there was an issue historically with how it was being applied and who was being studied, you would expect it to broaden a lot, you know? It's not a bad thing to have diagnostic criteria broaden. It can be tightened up in the future. This isn't like a forever trend. Researchers are still out there. They're still doing the work. If we need to tighten it up and we have the evidence with which to tighten it up, they probably will tighten it up. But right now we don't have that evidence. Right now the evidence is saying a lot more people fit this than we originally thought. And that's okay. That's a good thing. It's a good thing for people to find, even if they're not getting medical care, finding help, finding community, finding validation online, finding ways to help heal themselves. That's fine. A lot late diagnosed adults aren't pulling on the medical system. They're not pulling on the medical model of disability unless they have a comorbid thing like some other injury or medical condition that requires them to do so, but they're not doing it because of the autism diagnosis. They're doing it due to this other diagnosis, right? So like, they're not the ones pulling on the resources, okay? It shouldn't be a crisis of resources here when you're talking about late diagnosed autistics, okay? And like, okay, here's a parallel. I'm going to take it back to post-traumatic stress disorder again, just briefly, as like a parallel here. Post-traumatic stress disorder, that term came about after studying, I think it was mainly World War I veterans, okay? It was military veterans. Yeah. And as psychology had developed and as medicine had continued to develop, people started being like, you know what, we should do something to help our soldiers. Hey, we should study this more and we should figure out how we can help them with this. Because this is a real problem when they come back from war and they have these mental health effects. This is a real issue. We should deal with this, right? We shouldn't just be throwing in them institutions. Okay. So they started studying it in that population. Then, as time goes on, they start to discover that other populations also have traumatic stress. People who also suffer from other traumatic events can show the same symptoms as these, you know, as the military members with PTSD. Like somebody, a car accident, for example, they might develop something that looks very much like PTSD. Maybe it's not exactly Like they don't have the issue with like loud noises in the same way, but you know, they still have a pretty big, still very similar stress response to like driving in a car or having the flashbacks to the car accident, right? So they start to realize there's a lot of parallels here. And now the PTSD diagnosis can be applied to populations outside of the military because we know it exists in populations outside of the military. The more we know and the more we learn, the broader the diagnoses become. And nobody is out there doing a huge panic spiral about people, you know, saying they have trauma. I mean, they did with social media a bit ago. People had a whole conniption about everybody's talking about trauma. Everybody's traumatized these days. And some people are probably still stuck there. But yeah, a lot of people have it. A lot of people have some kind of trauma response, even if they don't reach the clinical criteria. You can still have sort of a subclinical, like, you're still having an issue with that thing. It's just maybe you don't fully meet the criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. Doesn't mean it's not bothering you, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't have access to help. It's just, I don't know. Am I wrong here, guys? Is there a little level of irony here? Anybody else have the opinion, of course, allegedly, of course, in my opinion, that this, Professor Frith, that Uta Frith is having a little bit of that weak centralized coherence around this, because she's getting really into the, like, I think she's getting into the specifics of like popular culture impacts and knowledge and internet. And it's like, that's just that's quite frankly, I do have something planned on this, which is, Uta Frith, you're seeing survivalship bias on your algorithms. If you're seeing a lot of people talking about autism and it seems like we're all self-diagnosed, blah, 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 whatever, you're seeing people who are surviving the algorithms. And as a well-renowned emeritus research professor in autism, you probably get fed a lot of information about autism because your algorithms probably know that. You know? The AI, the company, they know what you're into. Okay. They know that that's your interest. All right. So like, you might be falling to a logistical bias here, and the panic isn't actually real. There's a moral panic coming out. I personally think a lot of it is more of like moral panic levels of concern around it, when it's actually probably just more of like, we're all having a logical bias. We're falling victim to survivorship bias that makes us think everybody's autistic. And it's like, no, you're just being fed a lot of autistic content online. That doesn't mean everybody is autistic. It just means that is all you're seeing. And you're falling victim to like cognitive biases that lead you to think this is the world now. It's like, no, that's just that's your For You page. FYP, you know? Anyway, I can get into that some other time. Let's finish up here really quickly. I'm going to go ahead and finish up this article real quick, and then, yeah, I want to hear what you guys think. But she goes on to say, autism is no longer just a medical term. It has become part of popular culture. Same with dementia. Same with dementia and PTSD, Uta Frith. Same with depression and anxiety. Those aren't just medical terms either. They're also in the popular culture. Where's the moral panic about those? I don't know. Social media, films, and online communities have helped people share experiences, but they've also spread simplified or misleading ideas. Yeah. Because once things enter popular culture, you are no longer in control of the narrative. Like, you cannot... People are going to take it and they're going to run with it, and they might be incredibly wrong about it, but, like, that's how information spreads. That's how things happen. That's how myths get developed. I know. It sucks, but it's like... I don't think anyone actually has the power to truly stop that. I'm going to be honest. And I don't think changing the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 is going to stop that either, by any means. So she continues. At the same time, the idea of neurodiversity has encouraged people to see autism as a difference rather than a disorder. While this helps reduce stigma, it also creates tension. If autism is not a disorder, why use a medical diagnosis? Because people have medical complexity. Uta Frith. Because individual patients, individual clients, individual students, children, adults, we can have a laundry list of multiple diagnoses. We aren't just one thing. And we medical complex cases, here's the thing, for researchers out there and for people who read up on research, medically complex cases, 9 times out of 10, those are the participants who are going to be eliminated from studies that are done by people like Dame Uta Frith. Because if she wants to just study autism, she needs to make sure she has participants who are just autistic. So she's not going to see the medically complex cases. Or if she wants to study the medically complex autistics, then she's going to eliminate the more non-apparent autistics from her studies. Because that is a valid thing. That's about validity when it comes to your research design. And if you're looking at correlation or cause and effect or something empirical, you have a hypothesis you want to test, and that hypothesis only relates to a certain population, you got to make sure your participants are that population. Otherwise, you're not studying that thing anymore, right? So you might be seeing something else that's confounding it. Research is all about taking complex ideas and wheedling it down and controlling it so that hopefully you can just get down to what are actual effects that are actually happening. What are you actually seeing here? Not just what, all the other complexities. We want to wheedle those down a little bit. It's called degrees of freedom. You're trying to reduce those degrees of freedom to get really clean data, to get a clear look. Okay? Real life is not like that. Real life is very much not like that. Medical diagnoses should not be like that, though sometimes they are. That's usually when doctors aren't listening to people and like ignoring women's pain and Black people's pain and things like that. But, autism can be both a disorder and a medical diagnosis, and it can be used in conjunction with other medical diagnoses, such as like epilepsy or other seizure disorders or neurological disorders, limb apraxia, oral apraxia, apraxia of speech, like celiac disease. They can come with so many things. We don't need autism. One diagnosis doesn't actually need to encompass everything that an individual can have going on throughout their entire life. And quite frankly, in my opinion, it shouldn't. We should all have the ability to receive the diagnoses we need to receive throughout life. You can be a non-apparent autistic and then have a medical condition, develop an autoimmune condition or something later in life, or be a non-apparent autistic with endometriosis and chronic pain. You should be able to have those diagnoses. They can come all wrapped in one person because humans be messy like that. And that's okay. And every diagnosis opens up the door for more needed care. And that's okay. I have seen clients, students, patients with 8 diagnoses, especially by the time they're older, talking adults and skilled nursing and stuff. Oh man, they got diagnoses coming out the wazoo. Okay. So many diagnoses, and they're getting the care. They're in a skilled nursing facility for 24/7 care because they have so many diagnoses. They need that care. That's why they're getting the care. That's how it's set up. You know what I'm saying? Okay. She calls for a rethink of how autism is defined and diagnosed. Instead of one broad spectrum, she suggests splitting autism into clear subgroups, focusing on individual specific needs, prioritizing support for those with the greatest difficulties, and improving diagnostic precision. That's what the levels are. The level 1, level 2, level 3. That's supposed to be individual profiles of a person's need in different areas of the disorder. Because you have to have, autism is not just social communication, right? You have these other classifications you have to have as well, right? You have to fit these other categories where you're having difficulties. And the levels can be set to the different categories. Where they are on those different categories, that's the level. That's the individual profile. It's already in there. Uta Frith. Dame Uta Frith, who has no idea I exist and who will probably never have any idea I exist. We already have it in there. It's already there. We don't have to do anything. It's already there. The experts who came together and made the autism spectrum disorder the whole spectrum for DSM-5, they considered all of that and they put it in there. We have the subgroups. Those are the levels. Yeah, people who have medical needs, they get more support. We already do that. Anyway, she said, the time has come to examine whether the autism spectrum has become too broad. It has not. It is not, in my opinion. Without greater precision, we risk misunderstanding people's needs and misdirecting care. Yes, and without actually listening to clinicians who are really doing the on-the-ground profiling and individuating of people who need this diagnosis and who come with other diagnoses, we risk creating a giant moral panic and creating a giant mess over something that's going to have no actual impact to society, funding, or people's lives. Little academic soapbox for you guys out here, okay? A little tea. Little academic tea for you, okay? There is a thing that happens. This is my opinion, and this is just based off my observation, but sometimes professors in fields that change relatively quickly related to other hard sciences, so like behavioral sciences, like psychology. These fields, lots of stuff changes throughout the decades, okay? Been a lot of growth in that field. Been a lot of changes, been a lot of, tossing out of unethical studies and revisiting unethical studies and revisiting things we thought were true. Some researchers are coming into the field, rightfully so, from other cultural backgrounds. We have more people from marginalized groups joining the ranks of researchers out there, and they're developing things like Damian Milton and the double empathy problem, which is kind of the opposite of the whole theory of mind thing. Okay. Instead of not being able to take perspective, there's difficulty taking perspective, but it goes both ways because the brain is just wired differently and they're perceiving things differently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That came out of an argument against this idea that it's the deficits that's the problem, right? That's the pathologizing paradigm. That's something is clearly wrong here. Let's identify what's wrong, which, no offense to Uta Frith, no one in the 60s or 70s was really doing research not in a pathology, like a pathologizing program. Nobody was salutogenic, okay, with that. Not really. And if they were, they probably weren't any big name that we know of, okay? They probably weren't getting published in the big journals and having these like world-renowned careers, okay? So if you were a researcher with some level of ambition, you're going to sort of stay on the straight and narrow of your time and you're going to do research per how people had done research prior to you. So yeah, a lot of her research probably involved a lot of middle to upper class white boys. Pretty sure. I haven't looked into her whole oeuvre of research, but I bet her whole body of work, haven't looked into it, but I bet you a lot of it. It's middle class to upper class, well-educated families with white boys who were displaying autistic traits. Autistic research is kind of going in a different direction from her research. Maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe from a trauma-informed perspective, it's probably not fun to see all your entire research possibly just become a footnote of here's research based in societal stigma that's now considered defunct in terms of just societal stigma and, classism, racism, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that would feel very good to feel like your entire body of work might possibly go that direction. But, she did good work with what she knew. But now we know better. So now we do a little better. And that's good. And we want to keep doing better. We don't want to go backward and make things more narrow and then make diagnosis harder for the groups that have been misdiagnosed and ignored by medical systems for centuries at this point. If we narrow it right now based off of research we currently have, we're narrowing it back down to criteria that mainly fit middle-class white boys. And the reason we needed to broaden that criteria is because that particular diagnostic criteria does not fit, and it means we miss people, and it means those people receive the wrong diagnoses and the wrong treatment, just like she was saying. So broadening the whole thing in DSM-5, let me tell you this, okay? DSM-5 came out in 2013? It's already fairly old. These experts, these researchers, these physicians, and psychologists and such, they were not swayed by social media. They didn't broaden this because of social media push, okay? They put out article upon article explaining what they were doing and why they were doing it, okay? And is it perfect? No. Psychology is not perfect either, though. Narrowing a diagnostic criteria does not lend the system, whether you have socialized medicine funded by the government or whether you're in the hellscape of the United States medical system held by for-profit insurance companies. None of them want to actually spend money on people, okay? This does not help the issue of getting the medical support people need because that takes money. The money is the issue. So I don't think we need to focus so much on splitting the diagnosis. I think we need to focus on pushing politicians. Well, in the United States, we need better laws forcing insurance companies to actually, do their job and keep the population healthy. Or maybe we could actually get socialized medicine. That would be great. But also for countries with more socialized medicine, push your politicians to make sure they fund the medical needs. Because the medical needs of autistics with complex medical needs, those medical devices, medical treatments, all that stuff, that's only going to help everybody. There are plenty of other people with other things who are going to need to access the same medical help. So funding that medical help helps everybody. So that should be the focus. Nobody's stealing anybody's thunder here, actually. It just feels like it because you got algorithms, you got social media, but that's a separate issue. That's like a sociology thing, quite frankly. We're getting stuck in the weeds here. We're only looking at those trees. And there's a much larger forest of we need to fix economic, medical systems, economics, maybe stop the oligarchs from taking over the world and suppressing wages constantly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Much bigger issues here. And help broaden things so that we can be more inclusive and not ignore people who just don't fit the young middle-class white boy profile. So, okay. Anyway, that was a lot. But that is my thing. And I respect what she's done. She's a really big researcher. I'm not trying to knock on a woman researcher in the 60s. I mean, that's already major kudos. Okay. I just want to quickly say I'm running out of battery, but, major kudos to that. And that's great. And it's wonderful. And I love the work that she did and the fact that she was a woman out there doing it. Yeah. Heck yeah. But at the same time, she's older now. The world has changed and the research path has shifted as well, especially in the UK. There's a lot more research going into comorbid mental health things and trauma, and double empathy problem has really expanded into a lot of other areas, which I am going to do a video on. That's one of the deep dives I need to do. And I'm just still digging it up and looking into things, guys. So pardon. Thank you for your patience. I'm waiting on that one to come out. But we're nowhere near equity. We're nowhere near equitable access for medical needs, medical care for marginalized groups. Nowhere near it. So we really don't need this discussion of this is now too broad. It includes too many people. We got to put the genie back in the bottle. No, we don't. No, we don't. Genie's out. We're done. Listen, nobody puts genie back in the quarter, okay? Anyway, let me know what you guys think. If any of these takes resonate with you, or if you think I'm wrong, you can give me some constructive criticism, please. I ask for constructive and not attacks, please. But yeah, just let me know what you think. Was any of this, am I coming at this in a different way that you haven't heard before? What do you think about the idea of splitting the spectrum or not? I just don't think it's going to do anything functionally, because I think the bigger issues are systemic issues that are they're not caused by the diagnostic criteria shifting. These issues existed in the DSM-4 when we had the Asperger's and autism break as well. And the issues are systemic. They're financial mostly and systemic. With all that said, I wish you all a good couple of weeks or so until I see you next. If you liked this video, hit like. And if you feel like you like what I have to say, hit subscribe. It always gives me a little extra motivation. And it also helps the algorithm know to grow this channel a little more, send it out to more people. Thank you for those of us who are currently just subscribed and watching. Love you guys. And in an effort for us to build a safer community here and use our weirdest powers for good, for connection, let's all keep it weird. And until next time, you guys. All right. Bye.